Each year, Microsoft Research hosts hundreds of influential speakers from around the world, including leading scientists, renowned experts in technology, book authors, and leading academics, and makes videos of these lectures freely available.
Okay, good afternoon, everybody. I'm Rob Reeder from the Tux team, and it's my pleasure to be introducing Aleecia McDonald today. Aleecia has just completed her PhD in engineering and public policy at Carnegie Mellon, and was in the CUPS lab, which is Lori Crainer's lab, and I'm also a graduate of the CUPS lab. And while I was doing my PhD, Aleecia was a key person helping me get one of my last studies done. So in a way, I owe her my job here, so and my PhD. So Aleecia's known for work she's done in gauging consumer attitudes about privacy, and she's also, some of you may have heard of the work she did a year or two ago, showing that if every web user actually read the privacy policy of every website they visited, it would cost the US economy more than the bank bailout did. So that's a pretty nice result. So anyway, Aleecia McDonald.
So Rob is incredibly generous here. Actually, he was one of the first people to mentor me through how to do good research and how to get good results. So I feel like I owe my PhD to Rob. And we had the same advisor, so we're sort of like academic siblings. So he's been the older brother for me, paving the way. Thank you very much for setting this up today. So our co-advisor is Lori Faith Crainer at Carnegie Mellon, and I'm talking about 3 different research studies that we did. One, we look at types of advertising that are targeted that are not necessarily behavioral advertising. And then 2 very related studies are about behavioral advertising. The first was in-depth interviews, did lab study with 14 people, and then a follow-on much larger study, which is the survey of perceptions. And then I'll wrap this up with discussion of some points for technologists and also people in education and some policy implications from this work. So all of these papers are available from the CUPS website or from my personal website. Feel free to check them out, especially people who might be watching this remotely or online at a later date. If you'd rather just skim through the papers, they're available. So first, I'll be talking about this concept of advertising that's not just behavioral, that's targeted. And there's been a lot of focus on behavioral from the FTC. So sort of for context for this, just taking a step back for a moment, the lament that advertisers have and have had for a very long time, one of the very first department store owners in the United States complained that half of the money he spends on advertising is wasted, but his trouble is he doesn't know which half. And this makes sense. Unless you're selling Coca-Cola, there are very few universal products. Right? There are specific people who are specific buyers for your product. So the goal then, to be more efficient, to save money, is to match ads to likely buyers. What this implies, though, is that you need to know something about those buyers in order to be able to match ads to them. So I think everyone in the room is familiar with this. I'm going to go through this really quickly. We studied 5 different types of internet advertising. First, for contextual, the idea here is that if you have ads that are about a topic like quilting or golf, put them on sites that are about that topic. Behavioral, if a user visits a quilting site, a golf site, and does searches for, say, retirement, those aggregate together and you can make some assumptions about those person and show them ads that seem most relevant to them based on their behaviors. An affiliate is a really complicated term right now. It's kind of undergoing change. Different groups mean different things when they say affiliate. In one case, affiliates refers to other companies, sort of like MLM or performance marketing. In another case, affiliates are other people, your friends, the people you affiliate with. So rather than try to pin this down as one or the other, we took the example of Facebook Beacon, which does both. And we used that as the basis for our examples for these studies. So Facebook Beacon, where you had your friends seeing the types of purchases that you made from Facebook affiliates, right? Both uses. And then if affiliate's hard to define, defining cloud is still really difficult. There are plenty of articles about people failing to define what cloud computing means. But we can just talk quickly about that as being something hosted, that you have some content, maybe email, maybe photos, hosted someplace beyond just your company or your home computer where it's locally stored, and that ads are then based on that hosted content. And then DPI-based, the idea here is that you have some content that's broken into packets, and the packets are transmitted, and usually at the server side from an ISP, those packets are then investigated, and the ads are based on the content in those packets.
DPI stands for?
Deep Packet Inspection, thank you very much. I assume everybody at Microsoft knows what that means, but you're right to call me on that since this goes beyond Microsoft's walls. Thank you. And if anybody has clarifying questions, please do ask them as I go. We actually have a fair amount of time. If you have questions that go too long, I'll cut you off and put you to the end, but feel free to ask, and you'll at least get first call at the end. Yeah?
So the difference between contextual and cloud-based is contextual is based on the site or the context that the server is providing. Cloud is based on my data.
So the question that was asked, since the speaker isn't mic'd, is the difference between contextual and cloud. So contextual is, yes, based on you have a website that has a topic, or perhaps content on that website on a certain topic, and the ads are related to that topic. Versus cloud-based is you have data that you have that's being stored for you someplace else, and then the ads are being based on that. The way that we set this up, that's how those were defined. So one of these things is not like the others. Contextual is, as you say, based on the websites. The other four here are based on user data, one way or another. And where there's user data, there are privacy issues. So we looked at three different types of things that come up here. There are issues in terms of what data is collected, search terms, what websites are visited, things along those lines. The inferences that are then reached based on the data that's collected can also be sensitive. And finally, the categories themselves. For example, over 30, overweight, right? Some of these categories, even without the data behind them anymore, can be things that people find to be sensitive. Yep.
Isn't there a privacy issue even with contextual, because the place that I'm visiting is also private?
Yes, there can be, to repeat the question a little bit as I answer, there can be issues about privacy with contextual as well. So the privacy issues are generally more salient and also a little bit newer for things that are not contextual. People are not as used to that. And there's also sort of a concept of tracking. But the privacy issues are, for just banner ads, dramatically reduced for contextual. For something where people are not getting data back about the user. But most ads today are not just banner ads, right? We're not living in that world. So the data here, there's kind of another catch. Some of the data at some times are inherently non-anonymized in their raw form. So as an example of that, the AOL search terms that were released, people ego surf. They search for their names. IP addresses sometimes are dynamic, often are not, and in European countries are termed as personally identifiable information. And browser fingerprinting, I think most people have seen a great paper that came out recently that about 80% of browsers, if they have JavaScript turned on, which most people do, are uniquely identifying. So we took a look at these 5 different types of advertising, and we did an online study with 300 subjects, and we had a between subjects design. Now, one of the things we found with these 5 different categories that I just stepped through with little pictures that you still had questions about when I finished was that nobody understands just the terms as we mean them. When we ask users, they don't get what that means. So we had to illustrate them, and the best way to illustrate them we found was with examples. But then we were concerned that the examples might skew people's impressions. And then we realized, actually, that's an interesting thing to study too. So we took 2 different sets of examples. One set of examples about scuba, which is something that's not particularly privacy intense, and another example set about cancer, which is something people might want to keep private, control the information release on their own time. We also picked cancer because it's something that can happen to everybody, and there's no moral judgment attached to it. So people could imagine themselves having cancer no matter who they are. So for this particular study, we had diverse professional backgrounds. This wasn't just people in technology. It was skewed a little bit female, and we recruited from Mechanical Turk. So quick show of hands, people in the room, who knows what Mechanical Turk is? Okay, so about half. a little more than half. So Amazon has a site where they allow people to do tasks that are difficult to automate but easy for humans. And they pay people a small amount, right? It's a site where people can post a task. So for example, post an image and ask people, label this image. What is the image of? So a human can say cat, hat, very quickly. Much more difficult for a computer to do that. That's the basis for Mechanical Turk. It's also turned out to be a great place for people to do research, because you have a population of people who are willing to spend a fair amount of time for fairly low amount of pay, and there have been a lot of studies as to how good this population is and how conscientious and what you need to do to make sure you weed out the people who aren't. And that's a whole line of literature that's interesting. So we carefully designed for Mechanical Turk. And we paid people 50 cents for what we advertised as a 10 to 15 minute study, which was about what it took people. And we advertised this as a study about advertising. So we didn't want to bias people that it was about privacy. Two reasons. One, it changes your population. You get people who are either very concerned about or not at all concerned about privacy. You can skew it that way and not even know how you skewed it. And the other is we didn't want to prime people. We didn't want them thinking about privacy before we started asking them questions. So to go through just some highlights of the results from the paper. So we found that giving the definitions wasn't enough, and we had these two conditions, and we say it's a between subjects design. What that means is that half the people saw cancer, half the people saw scuba. They did not see the other questions. So we were comparing between those groups. And there's an example up here that we used of some websites use contextual advertising to change the ads they display in response to your current actions online. For example, if you search for the word scuba, you might see ads for scuba gear. You would not see ads for scuba gear again while searching for other topics. So we had 8 different adjectives, and the 8 different adjectives here are ordered. They came from doing a news search online for behavioral advertising. So some of these adjectives are positive. Those are mostly press releases from companies, right? So entertaining, helpful, those mostly are press releases, right? And then some of the ones that are not positive, invasive, pushy, creepy, those come more from privacy advocates. Those were also in the news searches. So we deliberately took half and half, positive and negative. So the negatives here are shown in the red bars, and the positives shown in green. We found the exact same trend line for the negatives and the positives. We could have just asked 2, but didn't know that before we asked it. So we combined those. And what this shows is a Likert scale. So we asked people, for this description we just gave you about this type of advertising, how much do you strongly agree to strongly disagree that this adjective describes this practice? So is contextual advertising invasive, pushy, entertaining, desirable, right? And so these scores on the graph are the mean answers across the participants and broken across by the scuba and the cancer conditions. So what you can see is that the positives go down and the negatives go up as we move from contextual to behavioral, behavioral to affiliate, cloud, and DPI. There are no statistically significant differences between affiliate, cloud, and DPI. There are statistically significant differences between contextual and behavioral and affiliate, cloud, and DPI. So people are seeing those as different things with more concern around the things that are coming to the far right. So we also asked them a question as to whether they would prefer a random ad or whether they would prefer a type of targeted ad. So again, those 5 different types. And you can see that for contextual, people prefer contextual ads to random. It's under 50%. But for behavioral, people 2/3 would prefer to have a random ad to a targeted behavioral ad. And for affiliate, cloud, and DPI, which again are statistically indistinguishable, it's just under 80%, about 75% would prefer to have random ads to affiliate, cloud, and DPI. So 2 caveats on that. 1, this is self-reported behavior, right? Behavior in the wild is always different from self-reported. This is people's opinions of what they think, okay? And 2, this is still early on targeting, which is a point that has gone back and forth in discussions with people today. It is entirely possible that I could run this study again in 2 years and find different answers. But as a snapshot for right now, people would prefer to have random ads to targeted ads. So I'm now going to get into sort of the bulk of the talk, which is these 2 studies, one building on top of the other, just about behavioral advertising. So we talked a little bit about how behavioral advertising works. So this all aggregates together to be a profile, and then the ads for behavioral advertising are based on that profile. So for example, Facebook thinks that I am an overweight mother in debt living in Pittsburgh. Right? Those are the ads I see. That is Facebook's view of me to their advertisers. So I do a lot of work around public policy issues, and there are some pending regulatory and legislative approaches that might start to happen around behavioral. So the FTC has a roundtable report that's going to be coming out any day now about behavioral advertising. I would expect to see that no later than spring. The NTIA also is involved. They're coming through Commerce. They will have their own privacy report coming out soon. On the legislative side, we've seen Russia's privacy bill, and then Boucher and Stearns have a different take, and Senator Kerry has been looking at this as well. He may come up with different text. All of this is very much in play right now. I would expect something to be submitted for the next session. We'll see what happens. But all of this is happening. So at the same time that there's possible regulation, possible law, there are also self-regulation approaches. So this icon here that looks a little bit like a power sign comes from an industry self-regulation approach where you have an icon likened to a recycling symbol that you put on behavioral ads, and then people can click that icon. They always know what the icon is. They can click the icon to get information. Why did I see this particular ad? It looks a little too much like a power symbol. They've had to redesign it, but that's the idea. Also, Yahoo and Google both allow management of interest categories, these behavioral profiles. So for example, if I'm interested in games, I can say, you know what, I don't want to have ads about games. I know I've gone to a lot of gaming websites, but please don't show me ads about games, and I can opt out of that particular category of interest-based behavioral advertising. Google has gone one step further to analytics data. Analytics data is frequently very similar to the data that's used for behavioral advertising, but it is not part of the US approach on self-regulation. The FTC has not issued reports and guidance about it, but the data is very similar. So the European countries have been interested in analytics data, and Google has responded by allowing people to opt out of analytics data as well. And finally, I love this example. Privacy Choice allows companies to put their own domain names in and get a report of what the actual privacy practices on their own website are. Because there's so many affiliates and partners, companies have no idea. If companies have no idea, what does that mean for users? Right? In an industry self-regulation regime, that's a really interesting question. But all of these self-regulation approaches are happening at the same time. So what I looked at was trying to understand what users know about behavioral advertising. Recently, there was a study that, or a series of articles that came out that was titled "What They Know." Right? I looked at what do they know about what they know. So a fair amount of this found that there's not been a whole lot of research right now, and that because behavioral advertising relies on cookies, you'll see me looking a lot about what people know about cookies, because that's their mechanism to express their privacy choices today. And so this research question is, do users know enough, especially about cookies, to exercise self-help approaches to privacy decision-making? Are they able to do that in practice? So the study design was twofold. First, there was a lab study of 14 people. They came into the lab, talked to me for an hour. It was a semi-structured design, so I had a set of questions I asked everyone who came through, but then I also asked follow-up questions. What do you mean by X? Could you tell me more about Y? And just these very neutral questions to get as much information from them as I could. And so we recruited these people in Pittsburgh, but they were not part of the Carnegie Mellon community. They did skew younger. Half of them were under 30. And we paid them $10 for an hour of their time. We followed up on, okay, we have 14 different people who give us a variety of opinions, but that's only 14 people. How prevalent are these views? So we followed up with a study of 314 subjects. And again, this was another Mechanical Turk design, very similar to the design of the last study. And again, from diverse professional backgrounds. And here we paid people $2 for 20 minutes of their time. And as before, we didn't prime people for privacy. We described this as a study about advertising.
Previously, you paid people cents for 15 minutes. Why did you have to go to $2?
This study was one that we thought was going to take them longer, and the last one had been 10 to 15 minutes, and this was 20 minutes. So we thought that we needed to give them more incentive. Most of the Mechanical Turks, it's a nonlinear function on Mechanical Turk. Most of the tasks are very quick, right? So you get paid small amounts for short times, and so as the time went up, we had to pay more than, say, a rational increase of, people aren't doing the math necessarily of how much they're getting paid per hour. But yeah, that's why we decided to pay more. It turns out that if you pay too much, studies have shown that people trust you less and are less likely to do the task. There's this great literature about Mechanical Turk studies. So paying $5 for an hour would not work as well. So we asked people, first of all, about their advertising views. And I'm going to combine, as I talk about these two, I'm going to combine the in-person lab study and the online study. If you start to get lost as to which is which, just remind me I need to be more clear. But let me see if I can keep that on track for you. So this slide is about the people who came in and talked to us in person. When they told us about their advertising views, they were pretty much pragmatic. I didn't get people saying, I hate advertisers, I hate advertising. Instead, they don't like it, but they understood that that's how things work. So one person gave a great quote. She said that advertising is like slow people on the sidewalk in front of you, and ads are just a fact of life. You kind of can't do anything about it. It's a little inconvenient, but it's not a problem. But they had specific, really scathing remarks about ads that they had seen that they thought were unreasonable or unfair. So, for example, they think about spam as soon as they hear advertising, which surprised me, right? I don't think of spam when I think of online advertising, but that was their first thought. They hate spam. Pop-ups, they hate pop-ups. And also things that don't have medical disclaimers on the web that would have to have pages in a magazine. Somebody just went off on that and how they thought this was unfair. So those were the types of things that I got some remarks about. But as a general thing, they get the idea that advertising supports free sites online, and they think that's kind of cool. They don't think that user data is part of that deal. And this kind of makes sense because offline it's not. If you purchase a magazine and you flip through the ads, there's nobody standing there with a clipboard, right? So they expect that their offline experience is how their online experience will work, especially when some of those publications are the same things they read offline. And so this expectation of offline world versus online world gets into their mental models of how things work. So two of the analogies I heard, one gave an analogy to shopping offline and said, you may be shopping in a public place, but there's still a privacy issue with companies knowing where you spend your money and time. They understand that it's in public, but they don't think that it's data that persists. Another analogy was to phone calls, and one participant told me that he understands recording conversations can be illegal and that it depends on the jurisdiction. But even if it's legal, there are certain cultural norms and expectations to privacy. So they have these views of how the offline world works. They expect it to work the same way in the online world. It's more complicated because they're sometimes wrong about the offline world. Right? So I had a discussion a little bit earlier about shopping cards in a grocery store. People don't understand how that data can and can't be used. So if you were to build a system and say it's just like that, you would be working with their impressions of it, not what it actually is. So just kind of things to keep in mind as you make analogies. Yeah?
I'm glad you're raising this point. In some of the self-regulation schemes that you've seen, companies seem to know this. And self-regulation, they come out and say, well, you can opt out of ads on our site, which doesn't mean they stop collecting the data about the users, but they do stop showing the ads. And this is their proposed solution, basically, to alleviate the users feeling bad about seeing ads, but it doesn't affect the data collection issue.
So the question, to just make it very brief, was about the difference between companies that say you can opt out of seeing ads even though all of the same data is collected behind the scenes. That is fantastic and is a couple slides later. We will get exactly to that point in a few minutes. So I'd love your take on that in a couple minutes. Yeah, that's very much the case. So one of the things we found was that there's confusion on users' parts between cookies and history, cookies and possibly browser cache, and that some of this may be due to the UIs in web browsers. So for example, If you go to clear your cookies, you might first have to navigate to a screen that says deleting browser history, or you might have a situation where everything by default is cleared together, or you might have all sorts of different menus that you have to navigate, and cookies are way deep in the stack. As an example of a vendor that attempted to do things a little bit differently, here we have cookies in their own place. It is under Preferences Advanced, but once you get there, cookies are separate from history, and there's a description. Cookies are small files stored on your computer. They allow websites to remember you between visits. The default is accept cookies only from the site I visit. So Opera's making the attempt here. Now, whether that's adequate or not, I didn't test. But notice there's no third party, first party, right? Not hosted versus local. They're making the attempt to put this in terms people at least have a chance of understanding at the time this was written. They probably could go more technical today, right? They probably could get to third and first party today, where they, at the time they wrote this, I doubt they could. Does this help enough? I don't know. They at least made the try. Since most people's interaction with cookies comes through their browser, if you're a company that makes a web browser, you have a tremendous ability to affect how people perceive things and their ability to control and their ability to enact their preferences. Yeah?
Given that Safari's browser default is to block third-party cookies, did you see any difference in the answers of people given that they might have been preferring Safari versus other browsers, whose all the other browsers' defaults is to allow third-party cookies?
So the question is about how Safari by default blocks third-party cookies where other browsers do not, and did I see any preference for that in the study? I didn't ask about that. I will tell you that based on the people I spoke to, they did not volunteer that. They did not seem to be cognizant at all that there are differences. I am sure that there is a subpopulation aware of that, right? But I don't think that's managed to make it out to the general population. I can't answer definitively, but of the 14 people I talked to, they were not.
Yeah, I wasn't wondering whether the people were aware of the difference. I was wondering if you collected demographics that said, you know, these people use Safari and these people didn't, and then do an analysis based on their answers to see if there's any correlation between that demographic fact and their answers.
So the question was then, did you do any correlation between Safari and demographics of why do people use Safari, and do their answers on privacy change? No, I have not. I would guess that with this particular study, I probably don't have statistical power to go back and do that. I don't think I had enough Safari users to be able to answer those questions. I don't think I would have the statistical power to do it. It would be a great study. I mean, I'm just trying to think like, oh, could I do that with what I have? I think the answer is no. I think given the Safari market share, it would probably have to be larger than 300 people to get a good answer to that. But it's a great question, and I don't have an answer for it. So we asked people about their willingness to pay for privacy. And in economics literature, we measure value by what people pay. It's a strict one-to-one, right? And there's a lot of literature around why people will or will not pay for privacy. And it's a rich, wonderful literature. I looked at a very small part of this, which was during the interviews, several people independently told me that paying for privacy is extortion. And I was really struck by that. That's not a word that would have occurred to me. And they felt very strongly about this. So I wanted to know, are those 14 people, the subset of that 14 people, did I just get cranky people on a bad day? Or is that something that's seen by a larger population? So these question stems here come from statements I heard from the 14 people I spoke to. And these responses come from the larger study of 300 plus people. And the Likert scores, again, it's that scale of how much do you strongly agree to disagree, and then the percentage is broken out here. So I asked people to respond to, privacy is a right, and it is wrong to be asked to pay companies from invading my privacy, to keep companies from invading my privacy. So 69% strongly agree or agree with that statement. Only 3% strongly disagree or disagree. And then asked similarly, companies asking me to pay for them not to collect data is extortion. Really strong statement. Only 5% strongly disagree or disagree with that statement. Now, a very different question, it is not worth paying extra to avoid targeted ads, and only 5% strongly disagree or disagree with that, right? So they believe that it's extortion, and they believe that it's not worth paying extra to avoid. How does that fit together? So the next point may be part of it. Advertisers will collect data whether I pay or not, so there's no point in paying, right? They don't trust you. And only 4% strongly disagree or disagree with that. And the other thing is this concept of a right. People were insulted when I asked them if they would pay for things. They yelled at me in person, okay? So this notion that paying for privacy, it's not something people see as transactional in a lot of cases. And I'm saying this broad brush, there are percentages of the people who definitely do see it as transactional, right? And so that's some of our people who are fitting into different buckets. But the majority of people weren't seeing privacy as something transactional that they should be asked to pay for. And then, okay, well, maybe instead what I'm running into is that people just don't like ads, and that this isn't about the data flows. Maybe people just don't like ads. So we asked, I hate ads and would pay to avoid them. And only 11% strongly agree or agree with that. So that doesn't seem to be the confound. Okay, so
Can you recap that data for us just quickly? I mean,
just quickly.
each
So
statement I think makes sense, but
how does it fit together?
what is the
Yeah.
takeaway?
So it's complicated, right? That's the first thing that you can say about privacy. It's contextual, it's slippery, it's complicated. So we'll start at that level. And the second was, we found people thinking that privacy is a right, so they shouldn't have to pay for it, and were insulted at the concept of paying for it. We found people who thought that companies asking them to pay for privacy were engaging in extortion, right? Strong word. But we also found people don't trust companies. So they feel that even if they pay for privacy, it doesn't matter. It's not going to help them any. And that there's no use in paying extra to avoid targeted ads, perhaps in part because they think it's a right, and in part because they think yeah. And then the last was, is it a confound on hating ads? Probably not. All of this invites more research, right? This could be a paper in and of itself to start on this and move forward. So this is a slide that I don't do everywhere because this is actually a little bit difficult to get through. I think the room's small enough that I can, and we have the time. Quick show of hands. How many people have heard of the endowment effect? 2, 3, 4. Okay. That's a start. So you guys can keep me honest. I'm going to try to do this quickly, which is, the idea is that if a researcher gives me a mug and it is my mug, I value this mug more than if it is not my mug. And so one of the ways that you can see an endowment effect is if there's a difference between what people are willing to pay for an item versus how much you have to pay them, what they're willing to accept to sell the item. It's not quite a one-to-one. It's not that if there's a difference between them, there is an endowment effect, but it's indicative that there might be an endowment effect. So we looked at this difference between willingness to pay and willingness to accept. This is sort of a follow-on on a study that Joe Trio and Chris Hufnagel did, a great study that looked at whether people would pay for privacy, $6. The answer was not really, very few. So we wanted to show a difference between these if there was, so we looked for $1, right? Yes?
What was the question in would people pay $6 for what sort of privacy?
So I'm going to refer you to their paper, actually, rather than do 5 minutes on that. There's a lot to that. And it's good stuff, and you're right that the details always matter. But they were looking at online advertising in particular. So that at a high level answers your question. But then they looked at whether people would substitute other websites, whether they would stop visiting them at all. It's a great paper. But yeah, they were looking also at online advertising, and it's maybe 5 years old. It's good stuff. So we asked 2 different questions. And the way that we asked these was we split people again into 2 different conditions. So they didn't see both questions. They only got one question. And we asked, would you pay an additional $1 per month to your internet service provider to avoid having your favorite news site collect your data for behavioral advertisements? Now, we had just asked them, who's your favorite news site? How frequently do you visit? So this was all very salient for them, right? We made it concrete. And then we flipped it around, would you accept a discount of $1 per month off your ISP bill? Now, we picked ISPs because when we talked to people in person, we asked them about this, they said, who would I pay, right? And so the only actor they thought of who they normally pay in their internet transactions is their ISP. So even though it sort of doesn't make any sense, right? Like, that made more sense to them than paying advertisers, and they don't understand what ad networks are, and they don't understand the ecosystem. So we found that this was a way we could phrase things that people got what we were talking about. And we did find a willingness to pay versus willingness to accept gap. 11% said that yes, they would be willing to pay $1 a month to avoid the news site collecting data for behavioral advertisements. And 31% said yes, they'd take $1 off their ISP bill to disclose that information. Now, don't go running out and starting companies based on this, right? This is self-reported data. If 11% of people say that they'll pay, that doesn't mean 11% will pay. But what this does show is that there's a difference in their perceptions between these two states, that they are not seen as identical. Now, here's where future work would be great. It is possible that opt-in versus opt-out triggers people's sense of my data, not my data. Is it the company's data or is it my data? It is possible that opt-in versus opt-out will affect how much people value their privacy, and that it is not just people accept the defaults, which we know from a variety of contexts is true, and that you can really manipulate behavior based on what you do for defaults, which is interesting. It may also be that they change how much they value privacy. Yeah?
This slide seems to me, I'm wondering if one of the reasons why you have been slowed in through this slide is because it seems like the 11% and 31% are for different groups, or maybe I'm just reading it wrong. So the way I'm reading this is 89% of people would not pay $1 a month to avoid news site collecting, and therefore should accept $1 a month to disclose. So isn't the effect here we're seeing between 89% and 31%?
Okay, so Stuart is asking about how the groups on this worked. So they did not see both questions, right? They only saw one question. So we would expect. Oh, so you're asking about the inverse?
Yeah. About data presentation.
Yeah, you know, you're right. That's a really good point. I should present that differently.
Because really,
rather than comparing the 11, I should be comparing it.
It's the same thing to be one of the members of the 89% group as it is to be one of the 31% group, not the 11 and the 31.
That's a good insight. I usually lose people before that, right?
That's an honest insight.
Yeah, I usually lose people on the idea of endowment effect, and so I've not tried to do this with groups of people who are large groups and have very different backgrounds. I just pull the slide at that point, right? So, and it takes too long to go through. We have a nice long window to talk today. But you're right, in terms of data presentation, it would be better if I flipped that. That's great feedback. Thank you, Stuart. Yep.
I don't understand Stuart's point.
Okay, I'm going to keep moving, though.
10% of the people who equate $1 with their privacy, and the 31% of the people who equate $1 with their privacy. So I think it is reasonable to compare 11 to 30.
So I mean, it should be the same number, right? But it should be the same either way. So anyway, in back.
I hate to confuse something that's already confusing, but I think this is not necessarily the endowment effect, because you already said that users were pretty confused and you presented the data in this way. One possible explanation is you say, will I pay an additional $1 a month for blah, 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 something which in all likelihood is going to have no effect on my net, how much of my privacy is disclosed. And the second question is, will you take $1 a month for blah, 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 something which again has no effect. Will I take $1? Sure, right? It's not, I don't understand how much privacy I've got. I don't understand how this very caveated statement affects it. So will I give up $1 for something that won't make any positive difference? No, I will not. Will I take $1 for something that won't make any difference? Absolutely, sure I will, right? I don't think it's quite endowment, because it's, the cup is mine or not mine. It's clear and atomic, and there's no fuzziness, right?
So that's a great question. One of the points that one of my committee members made during my defense was that it would have been really good if I'd asked people what are their beliefs before they get to this question. Right? So that we make sure, for example, do both of these groups have the same beliefs before they get the question? Right? what do they think the state of the world is? If it turns out that even though I had, people randomly assigned to each condition, that there are two different sets of beliefs by random assignment, then what am I measuring?
It's super interesting either way. It's like, what exactly does it mean? It's worth a lot more drill down.
I think so. I think this gets, there's something interesting here to study, but it is absolutely not definitive on any of it. So it's a great starting point for additional research. So in some ways, this is sort of like a pilot, right? There's been a lot of great work that's been done in similar areas. I would refer you to Alessandro Chisti's work. He's done some great stuff on endowment effect and some great stuff on privacy. And I mean, there's another question too of like what's tangible and what's not tangible, and it changes if you give people tokens versus actual coffee mugs, and it's fun stuff. Yeah.
I would actually suggest not going into that rat hole, because I think that what this shows is that people don't think about privacy as a simple economic question, and so attempts to use willingness to pay or willingness to accept a discount to gain insight into people's privacy preferences. And the reason that all of this is so hard and requires so much careful teasing apart is because the set of questions contain the wrong assumptions.
That's great. So the question from the audience was basically, isn't your question wrong? Didn't you just say on the last slide that that's not how people engage in privacy? They don't see it as an economic exchange. Why are you trying to drill down to understand how they see it as an economic exchange? That's great. So I didn't have the results when I designed the study, of course, but now that I do, that's a really good point. I think that's a fantastic insight. This is great. I come give the talk, I get more from you guys than you get from me.
I think the slide works well as the proof of why you don't want to do the economic. Right. So I think the slide is still useful because it does make that very important.
So it might actually say that you need to do
we can just keep having this discussion about you. Thank you for getting this started.
So I think, the other thing that it shows is that I did a very quick series of 2 questions, right? This was not the in-depth study that you would need to do, but is it worth doing or not? And I think it says behavioral economics needs to be very careful about how you do this, whether you approach or not. I'm going to move on. I'm going to regret showing that slide. Anytime, I'm going to go hide. So we looked at 2 different scenarios. Now, again, we have this situation where if you tell people things, sometimes they don't believe it's happening in real life. So when I talked to this 14-person group who came in and described behavioral advertising, one woman told me that, of course, this would never happen, and I sounded like her paranoid friend. Right? Her friend had a degree in computer science, and he thought everybody was spying on him online, and her friend was crazy. Okay. And as a researcher, that's really a challenge, right? Like, keep a straight face, like flat affect, right? We gave, for the online studies, we gave people hypotheticals, because then we didn't have to get past this, no, really, I'm asking you this question, answer this question. So we gave them hypotheticals. The first hypothetical was basically describing behavioral advertising. And we asked them if they thought this was something that currently happens. And so in the teal, 86% say yes, the description of behavioral advertising happens right now. Ads are based on where I've gone online before. 11% in purple say this isn't happening now, but it could happen in the future. And only 3% say that this is not happening or could not happen in the future. Green, 1% say never by law, never by consumer backlash in orange, and 1% with another write-in answer that they volunteered. So then we asked a second scenario, and we described ads that are based on email you send or receive. So not Hotmail, right? And we asked if people think that this does or doesn't happen now. Very different picture. 39% say, yes, this is something that happens right now in teal. And in purple, 28% say, this doesn't happen now, but it could happen in the future. And then a full third say, no, this doesn't happen. 16% say it would never happen by law. 13% in red say it would never happen because of consumer backlash. And the other 4% in yellow, I should relabel 4% yelled at me, right? I mean, the write-in answers are all, how could you even, blah, 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 you're evil, right? Okay. And it definitely wakes you up when you're doing data analysis.
Did you get any breakdown?
Did you get?
Well, I'm sorry, I'm getting multiple questions. Rob, you're going to wait your turn. Yeah, and it's the next one, so I'm not going to answer you. Go ahead.
Did you get users' email addresses to see how that correlates?
Both questions. I should have just gone with Rob. So the question is, did you find out what email provider they had, and did you see differences? And the answer to that is yes. And about 50% of the users are Gmail users, which was great because now I had statistical power. So what we found, and this is in the paper but not on the slide, we found that the Gmail users, 51% think that yes, this is something that happens right now. So there is an increase in knowledge. What does that mean? 49% of Gmail users think this is not happening right now. Okay? So, and from the audience, somebody says, what? So there's one interpretation for that, which is ad blindness is real, right? There are a bunch of ads down the side. People just ignore the ads. They're reading their email. They're not paying attention to the ads, so they don't notice that there's something in my email that is related directly to the ad. So that may be part of what's going on, is that they're not being informed even by using the product, right? Never mind informed consent and privacy policies and all of that, right? Even using the product, they're not getting it. So that is a statistically significant difference between the people who have Gmail and don't in terms of the level of knowledge that they have. This next slide, there's no statistically significant differences between Gmail users and non-Gmail users. So their perceptions, their responses to this, how much they like or dislike the practices, doesn't matter if they're users or not of Gmail. So these response stems, again, come from the 14 people we spoke to, and these answers, the percentages, come from doing the larger study online with 300 plus people. So we asked people, no one should use data from email because it is private like postal mail. And 62% agree or strongly agree with that statement. We asked people, it's creepy to have advertisements based on my emails. And 62% strongly agree or agree with that statement. And then it's not quite as strong a response for behavioral advertisement. So we have the scenario 1, these are the same two scenarios, scenario 1 on behavioral and scenario 2 on email. Only 46% in contrast say that behavioral advertisement is creepy, right? That's still a pretty strong creepy response, but it is notably different from email. Now, we got the same percentages when we asked the same question, which is always nice for research. No one should use data from internet history. That's a really strong statement, right? That's very blanket, not nuanced at all. And almost a third of people, maybe closer to a quarter of people, say yes, no one should use data from internet history. We also asked if people would be glad to have relevant advertisements about things they're interested in instead of random advertisements, which is one of the things that industry is claiming. So for behavioral, 18% said yes, they agree or strongly agree that they would be glad. And for email, 4%. And we finally asked, it's okay as long as the email service is free, that there's this trade-off, right? Only 9% agree or strongly agree that it's okay as long as the email service is free. And remember, there's no difference between the Gmail users and the non-Gmail users at a statistical level for this question. And even avoiding the statistical analysis, I mean, the difference is like 1%. So there are all sorts of implications about that, and I bet you're about to ask me about them.
People are just wrong, right? I mean, like when they say it's creepy, I mean, it's happening and people aren't noticing. Clearly, it's not creepy.
So the question was, how can it be creepy if they're not even noticing, right? They're wrong. So that's interesting. So in fact, we're getting back to this notion of informed consent. So if a tree falls in a forest, it still falls. They just haven't heard it. If you're the tree, it's significant. Yeah.
So you asked this question, glad to have relevant advertisements about things I'm interested in, et cetera. Is this in the same questionnaire as words like creepy and stuff like that? Are they being primed to think that it's...
So the question order was randomized, but they're seeing it on the same screen. So they could go back and change their answers, right? And absolutely, one of the things I would do differently if I were to rerun this study is I would make it a smaller study with different pieces rather than one large study. because what I found over the hour is that people started to get more concerned, right? And as a researcher, gosh, that's not what I want. I mean, that's concerning to me as a researcher of what am I finding anymore. And so some of the question order, we were very careful to put things at the beginning before they had any exposure to anything else. But as you go through a 15 to 20 minute study, you can't have everything be first. So yeah, that is a real risk and that is a real effect. However, that suggests that as people learn more about this, their answers may change. In what direction is the open question. That also suggests that how the press represents things, how the companies represent things, how people hear about things from their friends, all are very important factors as to how people might react to this if those order effects are really very salient. And my personal experience is that they at least matter, right? I don't know how much. I can't quantify it. But as a researcher, I'm not trying to do education. That's a bad day. That's a bad sign. So this comes back to an earlier point. The NAI is the Network Advertising Initiative. This is a self-regulatory body, and they have an opt-out page. And this screenshot here is taken from their page. It's a little bit cut down. The number of opt-outs would scroll all the way off the bottom, so I just took a small segment. You can see they were alphabetized. But this is what people see. We did not test the movie. You can see there's a little clip in there. We just tested the text. Now, how much that matters depends on how many people view the text versus the movie, and NAI has not been responsive to questions about that. So I can't tell you if that matters or not. I can only tell you what we tested. When I talked to people in the small studies, some of them thought it was a scam. They didn't just misunderstand what it does or doesn't do. So we tested this with the large study, and we asked people, we showed them the screenshot from this and said, if you visited this website, what would you think it is? 34% say it's a website that lets you tell companies not to collect data about you. Now, as it turns out, it's not actually uniform like that. So for example, Yahoo will not change what data they collect or don't collect. They change the ads. The ads are no longer based on behavioral profiles, but the data collection is exactly the same. 25% say it's a website that lets you tell companies you do not want to see ads from them, but you'll still see as many ads overall. Well, that's not the case. You're not picking and choosing and saying, I don't want ads from the Yahoo ad network. Instead, it's that you're not getting behavioral ads from the Yahoo ad network. You still get the same ad networks. 18% incorrectly say it's a website that lets you see fewer ads online. So not only is that incorrect, the bold text that you probably can't read there is, opting out of a network does not mean you will no longer receive online advertising. Right? The NAI prominently disclaims this. It's not enough. 11% say correctly, it's a website that allows companies to profile you but not show you ads based on those profiles. And 11% in aggregate think it's some type of a scam, 6% to collect private information and 5% to see which websites you visited. Now, part of why it's very difficult to convey this is that these different companies have different practices. Opt-out means something different for Yahoo, for Google, for the ad networks. Google's approach is if you do the opt-out, they change your cookie so it says opt-out. Now your data is collected, but it's aggregated with everybody who has the opt-out token, right? So in fact, data collection does change, but it doesn't stop. And there are ad networks that in fact change so much that they stop collecting data at all. If they're not going to show you a behavioral ad, well, they're behavioral advertisers. They have no benefit in collecting your data anymore. They're done. So 3 completely different models, all presented on the same screen. And it's not a surprise that the text to describe that is difficult to write, and that the NAI has so far not succeeded in making it transparent to people what's going on that screen. So you had asked questions about that. Are you good on this? Okay. So a little bit of discussion before I get into some more specific points. Just overall, users don't understand how the internet works. They don't understand ads. They don't understand the data flows. There's more about this in the papers a little bit. they fundamentally don't get it. Now, maybe that wouldn't matter, except they need to be able to enact their privacy preferences. The NA opt-out cookies description we just saw is not currently working. And some current practices, like Gmail, are a surprise. Surprise matters here because the FTC sees surprise as a sign that something might be wrong. It's not just, oh, they're surprised. No, this actually, yeah, it's not just a birthday party. So the other thing is that users are okay with the swap of ads for free sites. They think that's a reasonable trade, but they don't think that their data is part of the deal. They're completely oblivious to that. And offline, it's not. Another point here is they think their privacy is already protected. So because they think privacy is a right, they think their privacy is already protected. Now, there's some much better work about this. I touch on it a little bit in the paper in terms of what are the laws. And you saw a little bit with those two scenarios. People think that by law, email will never have ads based on the email content. But again, Joe Trio Annenberg has done some great work that people think, for example, the link that says privacy policy means that they are protected by law, that it is not disclosure, it is protection. And we need to wrap up soon. I'm going over time. Given a choice, users prefer random ads to targeted, but a small subset welcome targeted ads. They really want this. And of the people I talked to in the lab, some were enthusiastic. They hate ads that have nothing to do with their lives. They're a minority, but they really want it. A slightly larger subset, but about on par, reject behavioral ads as an invasion of privacy. The majority of people in the middle just don't see any benefit. Why should they give out their data when ads are the things they ignore? So they're not interested in behavioral advertising because they're not interested in ads. They're ambivalent. They don't really, it's not that they don't care about privacy, it's that they don't care about ads. So for technologists, I would stress that privacy is central to users' experiences. When we had those 14 people came in and we talked to them about advertising, within the first 5 minutes, every single person raised privacy. That blew me away. I thought that those conversations would be about ads for a much longer period of time before they volunteered privacy. So it's not something you can just sort of ignore or sweep under the carpet. And engineers have a fast reach, much more quickly than anybody else to get things into the ecosystem, but you sometimes may know too much to empathize. So those screens of different browsers make perfect sense if you're an engineer, but they don't help you if you're not in many cases. And I think a lot of times engineers underappreciate the role that they play in conveying really complicated stuff about privacy to end users. Like, you make it happen for them, right? And I think most times people think about the functionality of the product and not in terms of, you also sort of have a user education role just in the way that you design the product. I would stress testing. So the NAI description, probably if they'd done a quick test, they would have found some other ways to address that. Browser interfaces, do people understand what the options are? And again, this point about users' mental models of offline systems affect their interactions with online systems. If you know your product differs from how they see the outside world, that's something you want to find a way to convey to people, or they will get confused. And just really quickly, the last two, for educators, this is about the same study on cookies I could have done 15 years ago, right? Nothing's really changed in terms of how much people do or don't know about cookies over time. That, to me, is a problem. And people want to know more. Even these under 30 digital natives were saying things like, I'd love to learn more information about how to protect my privacy. So it might be time to rethink how we're doing education. Yep.
But they're doing it for the wrong reason.
Yes. So Stuart says, but they're doing it for the wrong reason. Horror stories of stolen identities. Yes. And then, just I need to know more about how my computer works, right? There's sort of a generalized sense of, so here's something that blew me away. I think of the younger generation teaching the older generation about computers. Well, that's now flipped, right? People who are our age are teaching our kids, and they're looking to us to teach them. So we're sort of sandwiched. We need to teach parents and kids. I kind of think of like the kids know everything, they're on the cutting edge. No, they go to their parents. That surprised me. So last, for policymakers, there's some surprise over current practices. only minority want targeting, but if there's some way to satisfy that minority, boy, they're enthusiastic. They really do want it. This is a little bit of inside baseball about widgets. I'm going to skip that in the interest of time. And the question of, does self-regulation make sense when users lack knowledge to this degree? So thank you very much. If anybody wants to stay, I'd be happy to take questions as long as you have them. And by the way, you guys are right. Rob is right. This is a fantastic audience to talk to. Yeah?
I know your study was on specifically behavioral advertising, online advertising, but from a data perspective, you could just about use the data you collect from customers to send them specific CRM type promotions or advertising. Did that at all come, like, did people have at all any,
No.
Did they connect the dots that may be happening, or?
So the question was, you could use similar data for behavioral advertising to send things that are CRM based. Do users understand that that data can be used in both ways? So it's not a question that I asked of the larger studies. Of the people who came and talked to me, nobody was mentioning that at all.
And I'm wondering if there's like a trust factor or something like that. You know, if I'm an Amazon customer, or if I'm, have some sort of online service with Microsoft, like if I get that, would that?
And so another question was about trust. Would large, well-known companies like Amazon or Microsoft get more trust than smaller companies? So when I talked to people about trust, and this was from a different study, actually it had to do with Rob's work, I asked people, how do they determine which sites they trust? And their answer was, they use sites that their friends use when their friends haven't had problems. And so, okay, I could understand their friends don't get a book from Amazon, they don't use Amazon. I asked them, how would your friends know if they had any privacy issues? And they said, right? Like they'd never thought about it before, that there could be things on the back end that they can't see, but they rely on their friends' evaluation. Do their friends know more than they do? Probably not. Maybe some of them do, but they didn't say, I rely on my CS friends, I rely on my geek friends, I rely on my friends. So some of that may be sort of the a million lemmings can't be wrong concept, right? If something bad happens to a large number of people, it will get addressed much more than if something bad happens, even something much worse happens to a small group of people. But that may be a level of sophistication that people don't have. They may not be thinking about it that way. How much effect does brand have on trust? I don't know, and it's a great question. Anybody else? Okay, anything further on that? Oh, go ahead.
Just a comment, and see what you think of it. But when I talk to people in a lot of our business groups designing products around internet services, online activities, and things, on this subject, they always come back and say when they do user research that they find users do care about privacy, but when they evaluate privacy features in context with other features of the product, that privacy features end up falling much lower on the list of relevance and concern for the users. Like, so they'd much rather have a product that does certain cool features than use the one that's more privacy enabled. And so I think that's an inherent problem that we might have in designing products in this way.
So the question quickly boils down to, in the real world at other companies, it's been found that privacy matters and that privacy features matter, but they are swamped by other types of features. And so I think we see with something like Gmail, it wasn't just Gmail means ads and Gmail is otherwise exactly the same set of features as, say, Hotmail. Gmail was also really huge amount of storage, really fast search through all of your email, and even the way they marketed it. It was the cool kids, and you had to get an access code, and you had to know somebody, right? So all of these things are very different from being just an apples-to-apples comparison of privacy enhancing, not privacy enhancing between the two. And I think that's a great observation. And I don't know of any natural experiments where the feature set is identical except for privacy, which would be great to see, right? But I don't know of anything that does that in the wild in practice. If you find anything like that, let me know, because I'd be insanely curious to see how uptake is affected. Anybody else? Rob?
So people seem to say that targeted advertising is creepy, but they're not exactly articulating the harm that they think might come to them. Did you get any sense of what they're worried about? So
Rob asked the perennial question of what is the harm? What did people say was that they're concerned with? Creepy is vague. So I think what I saw was more of a generalized concern beyond creepy. But no, people didn't have a crisp example of here is exactly on July 24th, here's the thing that happened to me that wouldn't have happened if... I did hear things about totalitarian regimes. I heard things about Big Brother. I heard things about control. I did not exclusively hear control, but that was one of the things mentioned. There's a big question in privacy of like, what is privacy? How do you define privacy? And some people define it in terms of control and other people don't. And so that was reflected in the people I talked to. Some people talked about control of their data and some people didn't. But I think there's more of a creeping sense of where is this going, right? Rather than just a sense of reacting to what it is today. And there's sort of like a reaction of large companies have data, I don't know what data they have, I don't know where it goes, I don't know what happens to it, I don't know how it affects me, I don't know how it affects my life. And so those were the types of concerns rather than I am concerned that diabetes means I will have my insurance premiums go up. Instead, it was just this, I don't know what happens next. And somebody else is making decisions, potentially, and I won't even know that they happened. So it is very vague, amorphous, and it's this lack of education shows up everywhere, right? Like people just don't understand how the system works. So sometimes they're scared of things they shouldn't be scared of. There are people who clear their cookies for reasons that have nothing to do with cookies. They're not going to help them, right? They're over-clearing their cookies. And there are other people who are under-clearing their cookies. They would like the benefits that clearing cookies would get them, but they don't understand how to do it. Or they would like session cookies, but they think they have no choices because if they don't accept all cookies for all time, all websites will break. Right? So we have these two different groups, and their desires are not things they're able to make happen in practice for themselves. And that's what I kept running into. But it wasn't just people want X and they can't get X. It was whatever your X is, there's somebody who can't manage to figure out how to do it. And they're different X's. So my answer is vague too. Yeah?
If there's one group of people more confused than users on this, it's probably the regulatory agencies and Congress and people like that. You mentioned at the start, and I don't mean to give too open-ended a question, but you mentioned at the start that there are a couple of things coming down the pike there. Can you just from 50,000 feet tell us, is that just, motherhood and apple pie kind of stuff, or is there actually anything in there that would, speak to the, that would actually improve the reality we're seeing?
So the question opened with, if there's anybody more confused about privacy than users, it's regulators. And is there anything that's going to be happening soon that will change the way that things work right now? So I would disagree with the first part of that. I gave this talk at the FTC 2 weeks ago, and they get it. They're there. Will they change anything? Probably not.
What do they get? The users aren't happy, or they get?
Pick a point. I mean, they could have given my talk better than I could, was sort of how I walked out of that, right? They understood all of the issues I was talking about very well. They're familiar with them. They read a lot of the literature. They talk to the companies. They do all these privacy roundtables. They are just steeped in this stuff, and they have the backgrounds to be able to understand it. I felt like it was a room with the best privacy experts I've been in, including privacy conferences. Now, that's FTC, that's not... The politicians are a different world, right? So for the FTC, I don't think there's a knowledge barrier. For some of the legislative members, then yeah, there could be a knowledge barrier going on there. I think the FTC will have problems with the limits of their authority. And also, so if you saw this and the other 3 or so studies that comprise my PhD thesis, I described over earlier today as shooting fish in a barrel, right? Problem, problem, problem. I have no solutions. I have not seen good solutions. So that's one of the things that the FTC and legislators run into as well. How do you fix this? First, what is or isn't broken? And you can understand this and come up with completely different impressions of that. Reasonable people can and do disagree about it. I don't think it's just economic interests. And no, I think really people have different views of this, which is why it's complicated. Otherwise, we could draw a bright line and say, this is in, this is out. So that's part of how we get to self-regulation. We keep coming back around to self-regulation. People have different preferences, and it's complicated. So how do you solve it? If you have a concept on that, the FTC would like to talk to you, like now. And they would be very open to that and to what Microsoft or other companies could do to help address things and help in whatever that means, whatever solution means. In terms of the laws that are coming out, that would be its own probably hour-long talk. And most of that punts back to the FTC. Most of it is, one way or another, we will create a safe harbor, and companies complying with the safe harbor have advantages like they won't be subject to class action suits, or they can have people opt out of behavioral advertising rather than opt in. But the definition of that safe harbor goes back to the FTC. So even if we wind up with a law, the FTC will still be on point, I think, for a huge portion of what comes next. And it will be fascinating to see their report coming out in a few months. But I'm not expecting that to be a ground-shaking, earth-changing kind of a thing. Maybe I'll be wrong, but that's my expectation. Anybody else? You guys have stayed like 20 minutes after, and I've been talking forever. Thank you all very much. This was really cool.
Thanks, Aleecia.